I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're here in Queenstown, New Zealand to drive this, the new Jeep Gladiator. To say that the Gladiator is an important car for Jeep in Australia would be a massive understatement. This American brand has been struggling to keep people interested for a few years now. There's the new Wrangler, which we reviewed together recently. You can watch that by clicking up here, and that's pretty cool. The rest of the range feels maybe a little bit stodgy, but this is certainly not that. The new Gladiator, I reckon it looks mega. Both mega cool and mega long, because this is truly a long boy for the Australian market. It measures in at over 5.5 meters long. That's considerably longer than most other dual cabs on the market. It may not fit in your garage, but if it does, this package could make a lot of sense for you. It's pretty traditional. It's a proper off-roader, unlike some unibody based vehicles in this kind of lifestyle space. It's extremely capable, as you'll see in today's video. It's got a big V6 petrol underneath the bonnet, so no fussing around with the issues of diesel engines. As we'll check out in just a moment, the interior is actually nothing to complain about either. So in this video, we're going to do our usual thing. We'll check out how comfortable and how practical the Gladiator is, and then we'll take it on and off the road here around Queenstown in New Zealand. But before we get started, if you haven't subscribed, please hit that button below the video and the notification bell. If you've seen that Wrangler review video that we posted recently, the interior of this Gladiator is going to look mighty familiar. And that's no surprise, because obviously the Wrangler and the Gladiator share a lot of DNA, and that's no bad thing, because as we found out in the Wrangler, Jeep have really been working hard on upping their interior game massively, like almost to the top of the class, I reckon, for this ute. And that's a good thing for people that are considering buying this vehicle, because in Australia, we're quite used to pickups or utes that have really hard and brittle interiors, and that's not something you can say about this Gladiator. And I'll come to the specifics of that in a sec, but first, a word on the Australian range. Because we're still about 6 months out from this car arriving in Australia, we don't know that many specifics, price, which variants are going to be coming. This is the Rubicon, which is at the top of the Gladiator tree in the US. We'll definitely get that. We'll probably get the second from the top, Overland, and I would also wager there'll be a base model, which the Americans call the Sport. As for pricing, it's really anybody's guess. We'll see whether or not they make it competitive. But here in the Rubicon, you get all the toys. That starts with black leather seats with red stitching, which they look good. They're not that comfortable. I've done 300 or 400 Ks in this car over the last couple of days, and I find that the support on the squab is a bit lacking. That said, a test drive will work out whether the seats are good for you or not, but at least the material quality is nice. That also applies to the soft touch stuff up here on the dash and on the doors, the leather on the steering wheel, on the gear shifter, and the transfer case lever. The quality is probably higher than it needs to be, actually, because everything is soft and supple, which is a surprise. The design is quite industrial, a little bit retro. I think that works with the exterior styling well. So we got this lateral horizontal dash, which the designers say reference older Jeeps, and that looks cool to me. We got like rubberized finishes on a lot of the key dials, and then a great infotainment system. So FCA's Uconnect touchscreen is one of the best. As you can see here, we have wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but you can still easily jump between the car's own systems, which most vehicles don't let you do that super easily. So that's awesome. We've also got a decent stereo, and we have lots of like access buttons for stuff on the steering wheel, and most of the controls are clustered easily here in the dash. So I reckon the interior design in this car is a win. The practicality is good. We got big cup holders. We've got a dual layered box here under the comfy wide armrest, and other nice little touches like the fact that the door bins are actually netting, so your stuff simply cannot roll around. Plus, grab handles galore here. So if you can't hang on in the Gladiator, you're probably not trying hard enough. Now, what about space here in the back of the Gladiator? Because any dual cab has to have a good usable backseat, especially if it's pitched as premium, which I reckon this Jeep will be. So the doors, they're quite short, but they do open to 75, 80 degrees, which should make fitting a baby seat pretty easy. And that's made better by the fact that there's two really nicely exposed Isofix joints in both of these outboard seats, so no faffing around like in some utes. Door closes pretty solidly, and once it is closed, you'll see that space back here is pretty okay for a 6-footer like myself. So I've got loads of headroom. The cab is really tall, There's this little shelf up here where you can put some knickknacks. As for the rest of my space, shoulder room feels a little hemmed in, but it's no big deal. Leg room is fine. Toe room is really good sitting behind my own driving position here. But then Jeep, they love filling their cabins with Easter eggs, as I mentioned up front, and there's loads of those back here. Well, Easter eggs are really just little conveniences. The Easter eggs come from the fact that everything has a sort of heritage shape to it and references old Jeep stuff. The conveniences include the fact that in both of these front seats, you've got netting and also these like tough kind of strap things, which I haven't figured out how I would use those, but if you know, please let me know down below because I'd appreciate that. We've got air vents, which is great for a hot country like Australia. We've got our window controls here. Further on beneath that, we have loads of connectivity. You've got 2 old style USB ports, 2 USB-C ports. This American spec car has a US power point. Hopefully Jeep Australia can get that homologated to an Aussie power point. Then we've got 2 heavy duty cup holders where it doesn't matter if stuff gets spilt. And the bench is relatively angled. The backrest is fairly upright though. So in terms of doing long distances, I don't know, but what ute is great for backseat passengers doing long distances? You tell me. Either way, it's pretty livable and there's loads of stuff. Now, we don't know how much the Gladiator is going to cost in Australia yet, but in the US, the equivalent Gladiator costs 5 to 10% more than a 4-door Wrangler, so it's not that much more expensive. The reason you would buy it is because of the isolated tray. So instead of shoving all your dirty stuff after a day adventuring into the boot of the SUV, instead you just chuck it here in the 1.5 meter box, as the Americans call it, which has an integrated power point for the US spec car that I've got here. Hopefully that carries across to the Australian car, but other stuff like the spray-in bed liner and 4 heavy-duty tie-down points are all standard. Plus, that tailgate is damped, which most dual cabs in the Australian market just don't have. So what is the new Jeep Gladiator like to drive? Well, let's start on-road and then we'll head off-road, which is where this thing really gets to show how capable it is. But I'm going to start here on the blacktop because that's really where these vehicles will spend 95% of their time, and therefore they've got to be good to drive. On-road, just as good, if not better, than off-road. So, does it succeed? In some ways, yes. In some ways, not so much. Let's run through each of those points. So the first thing, which is good, is the engine in the Gladiator. So it's a familiar one, 3.6 litre Pentastar V6 petrol, producing 213 kilowatts of power and 352 newton meters of torque. Same standard engine that's offered in the Wrangler. It's been around a long time. It works. It's a nice, smooth, silky, naturally aspirated V6. It sounds pretty good when you're on it. The fuel consumption isn't terrible. Over our road trip here in New Zealand, we've got like 11.5 litres per 100 Ks, so not great, not terrible, but it's a good all-round engine. Now, there is a 3 litre V6 diesel that's going to be offered in the US, and I reckon that'd be a really smart engine to bring out in Australia in the Gladiator as well, but we'll have to see. In the Wrangler back home, there's a 2.2 litre 4-cylinder diesel. I reckon that would be a little bit modest for this vehicle. So no issues with the engine. Similarly, the handling was one of the biggest problems I had with the 2-door Wrangler that I drove recently because it didn't have great stability on road. Stability isn't such a problem in the Gladiator. The wheelbase is much, much longer than a 2-door Wrangler, and it's even half a meter longer than a 4-door Wrangler, and that translates into stable cornering mainly as an improvement, but also better ride comfort. The ride I actually think is pretty decent in the Gladiator. We've got a 5-link coil suspension at the back, and that in particular is fairly refined for this segment. It's basically pinched from the Ram 1500, which is described as the Gladiator's cousin vehicle in the US. So the ride is decent. There's still some scuttle shake from the tray when it's unloaded, but it's definitely more minor than in most dual cabs in this segment. Where I have a problem is in the steering, which is very, very loose in the Gladiator. Looser than something like a Navara, which has pretty loose steering. So it requires a fair amount of input to get like a commensurate turn out of the front wheels. And when you're driving quickly down a country road, it's not hugely confidence inspiring. It can certainly do it, and there's never any question that you're going to track the right line through a corner, but I think a little bit faster steering and probably a little bit more weight would have been a better balance. Now, the steering is really loose to help off-roading. You don't want your small inputs to translate into jerky outputs off-road, but as I mentioned, we've got to be realistic that these vehicles are going to be used on road for a lot of their life. So steering, I'm a little bit neither here nor there on that. Equally, there's a lot of noise because we've got a very, very bluff and upright front end, same as in the Wrangler. So there are other pickups in this segment, like an Amarok, that are a bit quieter, but I mean, I'm really kind of looking for something to complain about there. The brakes, they feel like they're up to the job to me. So all in all, the dynamic package isn't bad on road, but as I mentioned, where the Gladiator can really shine is off it, and that's where we're going to go now.
That's because the Gladiator, like other vehicles from the serious end of Jeep's range, was designed with hardcore off-roading in mind. In the US, these vehicles are celebrated for that trait, but in Australia, you're far more likely to encounter a Toyota or a Nissan far from the beaten track. So, is the Gladiator worth considering for its off-road merit? While it's far too early in this vehicle's life cycle to talk firmly about durability, in terms of outright capability, the answer is yes. Compared to other dual cabs, the Gladiator just comes better prepared out of the box, though there are myriad ways to customize it through both Jeep's own Mopar catalogue, represented by this absolutely mega doorless Mopar creation here, or through the aftermarket. However, as stock, Australian-delivered Gladiators will have a full-time transfer case, picking up on one of the key criticisms of another premium ute, the Volkswagen Amarok. The Rubicon will have a 4:1 ratio, while the lesser grades, if they mirror the US spec, will have a ratio of 2.72:1. Front and rear lockers will be standard on the Rubicon, which will also offer front sway bar disconnection for 30% better articulation of the front left and rear tyres. Rock rails are also standard on the Rubicon, which can hold 1/3 of the vehicle's weight on any single point. Given the Gladiator's mammoth 5.54 metre length and 3.49 metre wheelbase, concerns about breakover angles are only natural, but Jeep say they're confident in the 18.4 degrees they have achieved, while the approach angles and departure angles are 40.7 degrees and 25 degrees respectively. To achieve that departure angle, the spare tyre was pushed further beneath the vehicle. The ground clearance of the Gladiator is about 274mm, similar to that of the Wrangler, while it can ford 762 mils of water. Water crossings featured heavily on the international launch of the Gladiator in New Zealand, which had just withstood unprecedented rainfall during our drive, covering many roads. Those are the stats, but how does it actually feel off-road? Pretty confidence-inspiring, really. That slow and lax steering comes into its own off the blacktop, meaning your inputs are extremely deliberate. The solid clearance factors mean traversing obstacles is a bit easier than in some rivals, while the excellent ride quality means that during faster sections you can sit back and cruise, while unexpected bumps are absorbed well by the sophisticated shocks. Despite the lack of turbocharging, the 3.6-litre V6 offers more than adequate torque, especially when low range is engaged. Even though there will always be a sense of the Gladiator's length, it is a fairly narrow vehicle and will fit down many Australian trails. The front-facing camera makes seeing what is ahead something of a doddle as well.
So those are my first impressions of the new Jeep Gladiator. I reckon it's undeniable that this pickup or ute, whatever you want to call it, has a cool factor that many other dual cabs in the Australian market just don't have. It'll be available back home around the second quarter of 2020, and I expect interest to really build between now and then. I'd like to know what you think of the Gladiator down below in the comments. However, is this a pickup that you would consider buying over something like a Ford Ranger or a Volkswagen Amarok, or even an SUV that might include Jeep's own Wrangler? Let me know all your thoughts below. I'm very interested. As for what I reckon, I gotta say I like it. It's capable, extremely capable off-road. It's okay to drive on-road, but I just love the way it looks. There's something about it which seems original to me, and I'm glad to see Jeep re-entering this segment. Now, while you're down in those comments, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.